The transit pod lurched to a stop, and the doors hissed open, and I stepped out into air that pushed back against my chest like a wall of warm nothing. Not bad air, just heavy, about 12% denser than anything back home, with a faint purple tint bleeding into the sky at the edges where the sun was setting behind two moons. My lungs adjusted in about 4 seconds. My eyes took 2. 4,000 alien students were going about their afternoon, and every single one of them stopped. Not loudly, not dramatically. One by one, in expanding ripples outward from where I was standing, they just went quiet and still. Like someone had dropped a stone into a pond, and the wave was me. I was holding a duffel bag in one hand and a crumpled orientation packet in the other, and I had done exactly nothing except exist, and apparently that was enough to cause a small interstellar crisis. The orientation packet said, at the top in 6 languages, "Welcome all sapients." I was sapient. I had checked. Twice. My name is Marcus Okafor, and I was 17 years old, and I had just become the first human being ever admitted to the Galactic Consortium Academy. I had beaten out 43 other applicants from Earth and 612 from Allied territories, and I had earned my spot with a perfect score on the entrance examinations, and a personal essay that my counselor back in Houston said was the best thing she had ever read from a teenager. I had packed my bags, hugged my mom until she told me to stop, and boarded a transit pod that smelled like recycled oxygen and someone else's anxiety for 14 hours straight. And now I was standing on an alien planet, being stared at by 4,000 students who had apparently never processed the concept of a human being in real life before. I shifted my bag to my other shoulder, kept walking. The ripple of stillness followed me all the way to the registration building. The registration desk was staffed by a Velhari administrator. 6 limbs. Bioluminescent patches along the neck and shoulders that shifted color depending on mood, which I had read about on the transit over. Right now her patches were doing something between yellow and orange that the handbook described as professional wariness combined with administrative obligation. She had 17 credentials framed on the wall behind her, and a scanner the size of a small refrigerator on the desk. She ran my biometrics. The scanner made a sound like a question it could not finish. She tried again. The scanner made a longer, more confused version of the same sound, and then a small light on the side of it went from green to red and stayed there. She looked at me. I looked at her. She wheeled out a second scanner from a cabinet behind her. This one was newer, glossier, and had a little certification sticker on the side. She ran my biometrics again. It smoked. Actual small curls of smoke from the vent on the top. She stared at the smoke with an expression I recognized across all species lines as the face of someone who genuinely could not believe this was their day. A third scanner was located somewhere in the back of the building. There was a brief internal communication. Someone brought it out on a rolling cart. It was larger than the other 2 and had a hand-painted label on the side that said calibrated for extreme variance, which I found both reassuring and slightly concerning. It got halfway through my scan and then printed a badge and shut itself off. The badge said, under my name and photo, species unclassified, pending review. I looked at it for a second, then I clipped it to my jacket pocket, right where everyone could see it. The administrator watched me do this with all 6 limbs very still and her patches cycling through a color that was not in my handbook. My dorm room was on the 4th floor of the residential tower, and it was a reasonable size with a bed calibrated for my height, a window that looked out over the quad, and a second bed on the other side of the room that was already empty. The resident advisor was a Pelthian, small, round, covered in fine pale fur, with wide eyes that blinked independently of each other. She was stress-secreting something that smelled faintly like lavender and apparently functioned as a calming pheromone for most registered species. It did nothing for me except make the room smell nice. She told me, apologetically and at length, that my assigned roommate, a Charathi student named Silvek, had submitted a transfer request before my arrival had even been confirmed. Charathi were serpentine, venomous, technically the apex predator of their homeworld. Silvek had looked at the roster, seen the word human, and relocated before I had even packed my socks. I told the RA it was fine. She blinked both eyes at the same time, which I guessed meant relief, and left. I unpacked, hung my Houston Rockets poster on the wall above my bed, made the bed with hospital corners, tight and flat, and squared at every edge. My mom had taught me that when I was 9. She said if you make your bed like you mean it, the day knows you are serious. I sat down on the finished bed and looked at the empty one across the room, and then out the window at the quad where students were moving in clusters between buildings, none of them coming particularly close to the residential tower, and I thought about how 14 hours ago I had been in a transit pod, and before that I had been in Houston, and before that I had been everywhere I had always been. I was not there anymore. The mess hall had 94 approved dietary categories posted on a board near the entrance. I stood in front of that board for about 45 seconds. I was not on it, not even close. There was a carbon-based general category at the very bottom that had a small asterisk next to it, and a note that said, "Nutritional adequacy not guaranteed for all registered species." A kitchen bot found me standing there and offered me something gray and slightly textured on a tray. It smelled nutritious in the way that things smell nutritious, when someone has worked very hard to make them technically edible without concerning themselves too deeply with the experience of eating them. I took the tray and sat down. 3 full tables of alien students turned to watch me eat. I took a bite. It tasted like sadness that had been compressed into a cube and warmed to body temperature. I chewed it, swallowed it, took another bite. I was from Houston. I had eaten gas station sushi on a dare. I had survived my uncle's cooking, which was an act of love expressed through catastrophically misused spices. I had eaten a Carolina Reaper pepper in the 9th grade on a bet and walked away from it. This gray cube situation was not going to defeat me. I chewed slower, made eye contact with the nearest cluster of watching students, kept my face completely neutral, took another bite. 2 of them looked away. 1 of them did not. After dinner, I went back to my room and plugged in my lamp, the one from home that had a broken switch so you had to tap the base twice, and sat on my made bed in the purple-tinted dark and looked at my phone. No signal. There was no signal out here. There had not been any signal since the transit pod cleared Earth's relay range, and there would not be any signal until the next scheduled communication window in 4 days. I had a reflex, the kind that lives in your fingers before your brain gets involved, to open a message and type something to my mom. Thumb on the screen, nothing to send it to. I put the phone face down on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling until I fell asleep. Interspecies biology met on the 2nd floor of the science building in a room with stadium seating arranged in a semicircle around a central platform. There were 40 students registered. I was the last one in. I took a seat near the back on the left side, which was where I always sat, old habit from years of being the kid who needed to see everything coming. What happened next was polite. I want to be clear about that. Nobody was rude. But in the time between me sitting down and the professor arriving, the front 4 rows of the semicircle underwent a gradual, almost choreographed redistribution. Students who had been sitting in the center and front drifted, with excellent excuses and very convincing pretend reasons, toward the exits and the far edges of the room. Not all of them. 1 did not move. Right side of the room, 2 rows from the front, a Grelthian student sat with a datapad open and 3 styluses ready, and all 4 eyes aimed at the central platform like class had already begun. Small frame. Dense with books was the impression, the kind of being that had decided at some early point in life that information was the most interesting thing available and had simply never reconsidered. I watched that student not move while everyone else quietly shuffled. I respected it immediately. Professor Deln arrived exactly on time. Cephaloid species, 17 credentials on his faculty ID, which he had displayed on a small hovering badge beside his name tag like a reminder. He settled behind the central platform, pulled up the lesson display, and began talking about theoretical Deathworld biology with the confident cadence of someone who had given this lecture many times and found it very satisfying. Then he looked up from his notes and he saw me. He stopped. Not a full stop, a partial one. The kind that happens when your brain receives new information while your mouth is still running the old program and there is a brief processing gap. He looked at his datapad, back at me. At the display screen behind him, where the lesson diagram showed the theoretical anatomy of a human being in bright detailed color, I looked at the diagram. The diagram had my heart in the center of the chest, my liver where my stomach should be, and near the top of the skull, labeled in clear academic font, something called the aggression node, positioned just above the hypothalamus, drawn in red. I looked at that aggression node for a long time. It was not entirely wrong, but it was not right in a way that was very specifically wrong. Professor Delm recovered professionally, and I respected that too. He introduced me to the class by name and species designation, which he read from his datapad as pending review with only the faintest hesitation, and then he asked, with great academic courtesy, if I would be willing to participate in a brief demonstration for educational purposes. I said yes, why not? What followed was 40 minutes that I am fairly certain ended up in at least 3 academic papers. I held my breath for 2 minutes flat. The class record for most registered species at this institution was 11 seconds. I did not mention this was not especially difficult for me. I just held my breath and watched the room. Professor Delm dropped a datapad by accident when he was reaching for a stylus. Reflex, the deep automatic kind, had my hand out and the pad caught before it hit the floor. The sound of my grip closing on it, the small sharp impact of fingers on casing, caused a Rilthian student in the 3rd row to make a sound I can only describe as a frequency of distress and slide about 4 inches lower in their seat. Delm asked me if I would do 17 push-ups. I did 23. I lost count and overshot. I stood up and was not breathing hard. The room was making sounds at various frequencies. The Grelthian in the front row had all 4 styluses going at once. Notes covering every corner of the datapad. 4 eyes moving between me and the erroneous diagram on the screen with the focused energy of someone recalibrating a fundamental belief. Delm asked, for the official record, what Earth's primary apex predator was. What species had shaped the human evolutionary line more than any other? I thought about it, not because I did not know the answer, because I wanted to say it right. Each other, I told him. The room went quiet in a specific way. Not the scattered quiet of boredom or distraction, the gathered quiet of 40 beings absorbing a sentence that landed somewhere important and needed a moment to settle. Nobody laughed. I had not been joking. I think that was the part that got them. After class, the Grelthian fell into step beside me in the corridor. 4 hands, 4 styluses still in use, scribbling on a secondary pad while walking. 4 eyes pointed at me with open, undisguised curiosity that I found more comfortable than the sidelong looks I had been getting all morning. The Grelthian said, in flat, careful standard language, that in the interest of accuracy they should be formally introduced. Their name was Piv. They studied xenobiology with a focus on Deathworld ecosystems, and they had been looking forward to my arrival with what could only be described as significant academic enthusiasm. I told them my name was Marcus, but that Mark worked fine. Piv offered 4 hands at once, which I understood from the orientation packet was a Grelthian gesture of considerable respect. I shook one. Piv looked at our joined hands with deep scholarly interest. Then Piv said, with the straightforward honesty of someone who had never learned to soften a sentence, "You are the most dangerous thing I have ever stood next to voluntarily." I told Piv that was the nicest thing anyone had said to me all day. Piv considered this. Then all 4 eyes shifted into an expression that, on a Grelthian face, I was learning to read as a smile. We walked to the next building together. Neither of us mentioned it. We just walked. The gym incident happened on a Wednesday, which felt appropriate because Wednesdays had always been the day things went sideways for me back home. Not badly, just sideways. The universe had a Wednesday sense of humor, and I had learned to appreciate it. Physical education at the Consortium Academy operated around a gravity calibration room, a sealed chamber with 11 gravity settings, ranging from the near zero of deep transit to the maximum registered setting of 3.2 times standard. That maximum was theoretical. The faculty brochure noted that 3.2G was included as a technical capability, but had never been used with students, because no registered species could survive it without significant physical assistance. The instructor was a Morthari, dense, broad, built like someone who had decided that physics was a suggestion. He ran the class with a no-nonsense efficiency that I respected. He had read my file. He looked at me on the first day with the same expression that teachers back home used when they had a student who was going to be interesting and were not sure yet whether interesting was good. I asked, after the warm-up, whether I could try the calibration room at a higher setting. The instructor said no. Liability. I pointed out, politely, that Earth's surface gravity was already 1G and I had grown up running in it. That my mother made me do yard work every Saturday from the age of 8, including in August, in Houston, which was a specific kind of physical training that no certification body had officially recognized but should have. The instructor looked at me, looked at my file again, looked back at me. He set the room to 2G. I jogged. 20 minutes of jogging, not sprinting, not pushing, just jogging, a comfortable pace, the kind I used when I was warming up for something harder. The gravity pressed down on my shoulders like a firm pair of hands, and I felt it in my legs after the first 5 minutes, and then I adjusted and ran on. Through the observation window, the rest of the class watched. All of them, still, quiet. The Morthari instructor stood with his arms crossed, and his expression shifting from skepticism to something else in degrees I could track. When I came out, one of the Rilthian students was producing a sound that Piv, who had somehow heard about it by dinner, told me later was the Rilthian equivalent of emotional overwhelm expressed through involuntary vocalization. Crying, essentially, but at a frequency I could only partially hear, and that seemed to be mostly pointed at the concept of me, rather than at me specifically. I had gained a ghost by Thursday. His name was Gurak, Vorathi species, broad as a doorway and half again as tall, with a carapace that made the impact sound of his footsteps something you felt in your back teeth. Vorathi were not predators exactly, but they were built from a long line of creatures that had decided the best response to a dangerous world was to become structurally difficult to damage. What happened was simple. Gurak was coming down a flight of stairs in the main building while looking at a datapad, and he caught his foot on the edge of a step and pitched forward, full mass in motion, the kind of fall that ends with a medical report. I was at the bottom of the stairs, not trying to be heroic, just there. My hand went out, caught him, not two-handed, not braced or positioned or prepared. One hand on his arm at the right angle, body turning automatically to absorb the redirect, and he stopped moving forward and finished the trip to the floor as a controlled landing instead of a crash. He weighed, I later found out, approximately 400 kilograms. I had not thought about any of this. It took maybe 1 second. Gurak stood up, looked at his arm where I had caught him, looked at me, back at his arm. Something moved through his expression that went through several phases very quickly and settled into something formal and absolute. He stood very straight, clasped his hands in front of him, and announced in a low and completely serious voice that his life belonged to my honor now. I told him that was not necessary. He said that the necessity was not mine to determine. I told him I was 17. He said that the age of the honored was also not relevant. I looked at him for a long time. He did not blink. He had, I noticed, very impressive posture for someone who had just nearly fallen down a flight of stairs. From that day forward, Gurak walked 6 feet behind me everywhere on campus, hands clasped, face composed into an expression of absolute and committed protection. He was the size of a small vehicle, and he moved with the deliberate weight of something that had decided where it was going and intended to arrive. Having him 6 feet behind me in the cafeteria line made other students give me a very wide berth, which was honestly not unhelpful. Piv found the whole situation academically fascinating and began taking notes on what they described as an emergent human social bonding pattern driven by physical intervention. I told Piv it was just called catching someone who was falling. Piv wrote that down. The chemistry lab incident was not my fault. I want to be completely clear about this before I describe what happened. The experiment in advanced chemical studies involved a compound that, when two specific reagents were combined incorrectly, became corrosive at a significant level. The safety protocol was straightforward. The ventilation alarm was loud. When the alarm sounded, students evacuated immediately to the marked safe zones outside the lab. Everyone did this. I was reading the procedure manual at the back of the lab because I had finished the assigned portion early and found the supplementary materials interesting. The alarm, which hit at a frequency calibrated for the sensory range of most registered species, was in a range I could technically hear, but that my brain processed, in the context of a busy science building, as background institutional noise rather than emergency signal. The difference between those two things, for humans, is mostly about pitch and pattern, and this alarm was at a pitch my nervous system had filed incorrectly. I walked out of the lab 4 minutes after everyone else. I walked through the compound that had spilled across 2 floor panels. I wiped my hand on my jacket where some of it had splashed. The compound was labeled, on the container in large text, "Flesh dissolving, do not contact." My shoes were fine. My hand was fine. My jacket had a faint gray streak on the sleeve that I considered briefly and then stopped considering because there was a group of about 20 students and 2 faculty members standing outside the lab doors watching me walk out with an expression that I had no single category for. The incident report used the phrase anomalous biological resilience. This was the 3rd incident report I had received in 2 weeks. I had started keeping them in a folder. I wrote the word routine on the tab in marker. Piv saw the folder on my desk 3 nights later, at 2 in the morning, when they found me alone in the common room. I was not reading the reports. I was stacking and restacking them. Not for any reason I could have explained clearly. Piv stood in the doorway for a moment, and then came in and sat down across the table from me. They asked if I was sleeping. I said I had noted that I was not, yes. They looked at the folder, at my hands on the folder, then at my face, with all 4 eyes, in the way Piv looked at things when they were trying to understand something that their notes did not fully cover. They asked if the folder was distressing to me. I looked at it, thought about the question with honesty. No, I told them. I was just making sure I remembered it all. Piv asked what purpose that served. I did not answer that. I knew the answer. It sat somewhere between wanting evidence and wanting proof, the kind of proof that said I had been here, that the gravity room and the scanners and the mess hall and Gurek's footsteps 6 feet behind me and Piv's 4 stylus notes had all been real, in case it all stopped. I put the folder aside. Piv made tea from something that smelled like mint and something else I did not have a name for, and set a cup in front of me. We sat there until the sky outside the common room window started doing the purple thing it did before dawn. Neither of us mentioned what I had not said. That was enough. Kelvari was a second-year student of the Drethian species, and he had the particular quality of someone who had spent his entire academic career being the most significant thing in any room he entered. Drethians were apex predators. Not in a technical or theoretical sense, but in the full biological sense of a species that had sat at the top of their world's food chain for so long that it had become a cultural fact rather than just a physical one. They were large, angular, fast, with a sensory range that covered most of the electromagnetic spectrum, and a social structure built around the performance of dominance. I was not performing anything. I was just there. This, apparently, was the problem. The first time Kelvari walked past my table in the library, he did not look at me. That was fine. Most students did not look at me, or looked at me too much with no comfortable middle ground. But Kelvari did not look at me in a specific way, a deliberate way, the kind of not looking that takes more effort than looking. Over the following week, the not looking became something with texture, a comment in the right frequency for everyone nearby to hear, about species classifications and what counted as a legitimate academic placement versus a diplomatic curiosity. A deliberate mispronunciation of my name when he was talking to someone else, close enough to my seat that I could hear it clearly. The kind of behavior that had no single piece large enough to report, but that built in layers into something that had weight. I had grown up in Houston. I had taken public transit to school. I had been in rooms where people decided things about me before I opened my mouth, for reasons that had nothing to do with anything I had done. I knew this pattern the way you know the layout of a room you have slept in for years. Every doorframe by feel. I was patient. I was good at patient. I was also on day 19 of being the only human in a school of 4,000 beings, eating gray nutritional cubes and sleeping in a room with an empty bed across from mine, and my patience was a finite resource that I had been spending steadily since I stepped off the transit pod. Kelvari walked past my desk in the study hall. His elbow caught my pen and sent it rolling across the table and off the edge to the floor. He did not break stride, did not look back. His shoulder passed me with the deliberate disregard of something that has decided other things do not require acknowledgement. The pen rolled under the edge of the adjacent chair and stopped. Piv, 2 seats away, looked at the pen, looked at me. Their 4 styluses went still, which for Piv was the equivalent of holding a breath. Behind me, 6 feet back, I heard Gurak shift his weight. 1 careful step forward, pausing. I looked at the pen on the floor. I said, quietly, that I had it. I stood up, picked up the pen, set it back on my desk, sat down. Kelvari was at the other side of the room now, near the window, with a group of students arranged around him in the loose orbit of people who found proximity to confidence comfortable. He was looking at me, not past me, not through me, actually looking. For probably the first time since I had arrived. I looked back. Then I got up from my desk, and I walked across the study hall, and I stopped at a reasonable conversational distance from Kelvari, and I spoke to him in a level, conversational voice. Not loud, not heated. Level, the way you speak when you have thought about what you want to say, and have decided to mean all of it. I told him that I had been on this planet for 19 days, that I had not asked to be anyone's curiosity or anyone's problem, that I had taken a placement exam and earned a seat and I was sitting in it, that what he had been doing, the comments, the mispronunciation, the pen, was something I recognized, and it was something I had decided I was not going to perform patience about anymore. I told him that I was 17 years old, and I had grown up on a planet that had been trying to end me in some way or another since before I could walk, atmosphere and gravity and bacteria and my own species included, and I had adapted to all of it. That was what my kind did. We adapted, not because we were special, because we had no other option and we were too stubborn to use the option of stopping. I was not there as a demonstration or a diplomatic gesture or an academic curiosity. I was a student. I was going to keep being one. Then I told him he could do whatever he wanted with that information. Then I walked back to my desk and sat down and picked up my pen. The study hall was very quiet. Kelvari did not move for about 4 seconds. Then he turned and looked out the window, and the group around him redistributed into slightly less comfortable positions because that kind of moment changes the air in a room, and everyone in the room knows it. Gurak, behind me, made a sound, low, resonant, structural, like a building settling into its foundation after a long time of being uncertain of the ground. I looked at my notes and kept working. Someone had recorded it. Of course someone had. That was the thing about 4,000 students with data pads in every pocket. Something that happened in a study hall on a Tuesday afternoon could be on 12 networks before dinner. The clip was titled, depending on which translation service you used, something between Deathworlder explains existence to apex predator and human corrects the record on itself. It had reached 3 star systems and 1 academic journal request by the time I sat down to eat. The gray cube in the cafeteria tasted, I noted, exactly the same as it always did. The academy president called me into her office the following morning. Her name was listed on the faculty wall as Rector Thilinva, cephaloid species, elder generation, with 8 eyes arranged across the upper half of her face, in a way that meant her visual range covered nearly the full sphere around her head. She had been running this institution for 40 years. She did not lead with the clip. She led with tea and a chair positioned at an angle that was, I suspected, deliberately non-confrontational. She told me, after a short conversation about my academic progress and my dietary adjustments and my incident folder, which she mentioned with something that was probably a smile, that she wanted to ask me something directly. She asked if I was all right. I looked at her. 8 eyes, all 8 of them doing the same thing, pointed at me with the same quality of attention, the same read the whole room at once focus that I had seen in exactly one other person in my life. I told her I was fine. She said nothing, just kept looking. I told her I was working on it. She nodded slowly, and the tea in front of me was, somehow, slightly warm in a way that felt like it meant something. Later that evening, in the corridor between the science building and the residential tower, Kelvari fell into step beside me, not behind me, like Gurak, beside me, at the same pace, not speaking. We walked for about a full minute like that. Then he asked, without looking at me, whether it was true that humans consumed other species from their homeworld as a regular nutritional practice. I told him yes. He absorbed this. Then he asked whether this was voluntary behavior or survival necessity. I told him we called it cooking and that most of us did it for enjoyment. He was quiet for another moment. He said, very carefully, that he found this information difficult to reconcile with the general visual profile of humans as a species. I told him to take his time with it. There was a lot more where that came from. He turned and walked in a different direction at the next intersection. Not away, just somewhere else. The distinction was small, but I noticed it. Piv found me at the door to the residential tower and immediately asked what had happened because they had been watching from the second-floor window. I told Piv that Kelvari and I had had a conversation. Piv asked what kind. I said the beginning kind. Piv wrote that down. The assembly notification arrived at 10 in the evening, which was exactly the kind of timing that the universe saved for things it wanted you to have no time to prepare for. The subject line said, honored participant, closing remarks, 5 minutes, and then the date, which was tomorrow, and then the venue, which was the Grand Assembly Hall, which held 4,000 students across a floor space, approximately the size of 4 full city blocks. I read it 3 times. 5 minutes, in front of 4,000 beings, from 400 species, who had spent a month being afraid of me, or curious about me, or both at the same time, and I was supposed to say something. I sat on my bed, looked at the blank card on the desk. This is fine, I thought. This is absolutely fine. I cannot. I went and knocked on Piv's door. Piv answered with 2 styluses still in use and a datapad under one arm, and the expression of someone interrupted mid-thought, who was nonetheless genuinely glad to see me. I showed them the notification. Piv read it, considered it. Then Piv said I should simply say what is true. I told them that was not specific guidance. Piv said that I was the only human at the institution, and therefore everything I said was true by default, because there was no one to contradict me, and no competing data, and I had a fundamentally unassailable epistemic position. I looked at Piv for a long time. All 4 eyes were completely serious. I told them that was either the most useless or the most useful thing anyone had ever said to me before a speech, and I had not decided which. Piv said to let them know when I had. I went back to my room, looked at the blank card, picked up a pen, set it back down, made my bed for the 3rd time because it had gotten rumpled while I was sitting on it thinking, and my hands needed something to do that they already knew how to do. My mom had called the scholarship news the best thing that had happened to our family in 10 years. She had stood in the kitchen and read the acceptance letter twice, and then sat down in the chair by the window, and been quiet in the way she was quiet when something was too big for immediate words. Then she had stood up and hugged me, and told me to represent us right. I had been trying to figure out what that meant for 19 days. I picked up the blank card and put it in my jacket pocket and went to sleep. The Grand Assembly Hall was larger in person than in photographs, which was a fact that seemed impossible but was immediately true the moment I walked through the entrance and saw the full depth of it. 4,000 seats in tiered rings around a central floor platform, the The ceiling was high enough to have its own weather patterns in the upper section, a faint misting in the ecological zones built into the architecture for the species that needed higher humidity at altitude. The lighting shifted in spectrum bands across the room to accommodate the visual ranges of the assembled species, from ultraviolet sections near the upper rings to infrared warm zones at the lower levels. Every seat was occupied. I stood at the edge of the entry corridor and looked at it, and there was a moment, maybe 3 seconds long, where my body did the thing it did before something large, the slight increase in heart rate, the specific quality of awareness that comes when everything gets very real very fast. 3 seconds. Then it passed. I walked to the platform. The blank card was in my pocket. I put my hand on it once, and then I left it there. I looked out at 4,000 faces, 400 species, every shape that alive comes in, and I thought about what Piv had said, about truth being unassailable, and I thought about my mom, in the chair by the window, and I thought about Garak's footsteps behind me, and Piv's 4 styluses, and the pen on the study hall floor, and the incident folder on my desk labeled routine, and I opened my mouth. I told them about Earth, not the parts they already had, not the statistics about tectonic activity or atmospheric toxicity, or the population density of megafauna predators, or the centuries of internal conflict that came up in every academic discussion of humanity, as if those facts were the whole picture. I told them the part that the textbooks left out. I said that Earth was a billion-year-old planet that had been actively hostile to every living thing on it for most of that time, that the life that survived there was life that adapted, that the species that reached the top of that particular competition was soft, completely soft, no shell, no natural armor, no venom, no echolocation, no thermal vision, no regeneration from injury, thin skin, average eyesight, endurance that was better than most but not exceptional by the standards of the creatures they shared the world with. These were creatures, I told them, who looked at a world that was trying to stop them at every turn and decided to build libraries in it. The room was quiet, not politely quiet, actually quiet. I said they were afraid of us. I understood that. The fear made sense given the data. But the thing that the data did not show, the thing that did not show up in the theoretical biology diagrams or the predator classification indexes or the incident reports, was that humans were afraid too. Every one of us who had ever done anything worth talking about had done it while afraid. Not after the fear went away, while it was still there. Being afraid was not the interesting part. The interesting part was what we decided to do about it. My people had decided, a very long time ago, that afraid was not a reason to stop. That was the only thing I had to say. I walked back to my seat. The silence held for a moment. Then it changed into something else. Different species express recognition differently, some through sound, some through movement, some through frequency shifts in their bioluminescence. The Grand Assembly Hall became, for about 30 seconds, a room full of 4,000 beings expressing something at the same time in 400 different ways, and the combined effect of it was something I felt before I understood what it was. Piv was next to me. They passed me a note, paper, real paper, which they carried specifically for moments when they found digital too slow. It said, "That was true." Behind me, 6 feet back as always, Garak placed one hand on my shoulder. Large, heavy, warm. He held it there for a moment, removed it. I looked across the aisle. Kelvari sat with his back straight and his chin level and his eyes on me, not looking away. Drethian culture did not clap, did not vocalize recognition in the standard way. The Drethian expression of acknowledgement was direct, held eye contact without flinching. Piv had told me this early on when I had asked about it. It was, Piv said, the Drethian version of a standing ovation. It meant I see you as an equal and I am choosing to look. I held his gaze, straight, level, without flinching. We stayed like that for a moment. Then the assembly moved on. The transit platform on the last day of term was the size of a smaller building, with departure bays in 6 directions and a noise level made from 600 beings with luggage and schedules and last-minute conversations. I had my duffel, my incident folder, my rockets poster rolled up under my arm, my badge still clipped to my jacket pocket, species, unclassified, pending review. I had decided to keep it. It felt honest. Piv was there. I had not told Piv what time my transit was, and yet there they were, all four eyes, all four styluses capped for once, data pad under one arm. Gurak stood behind Piv. He was not my bodyguard anymore in the formal declared sense. He had stopped announcing it about a week ago, but he was there. 3 others came while I was checking my departure bay. A Rilthian from my biology class who had stopped making the overwhelmed sound when I walked past and had started saying hello instead. A Charathi student who was not Silvek, but who had sat next to me in advanced chemistry for the last 3 weeks and had not transferred. A Morthari who had been in the gravity calibration room on the first day and had started running the higher settings himself. Nobody had arranged this. They had just shown up. Piv asked if I would return. I thought about Houston, about my mom, about the yard work and the hospital corners and the thumb that had hovered over an empty message screen on the first night, about what it felt like to be the only one of something and to find out, slowly, in the space of a month, that only was a different thing than alone. I thought about 4,000 faces in a room built for everyone but me, all of them watching. I said yes. I did not say that this was the first place that had ever made me feel like the world was still being built, and I might have a hand in what it became. I did not say that somewhere between the smoking scanner and the study hall pen and the blank card in my jacket pocket I had figured out what my mom meant when she said represent us right. I did not say any of it. I said yes. Got on the transport, found a window seat. The academy sat in the middle of the campus grounds, stone and glass, and layered with the ecological zones that kept 400 species comfortable. And as the transport lifted and banked, and the purple-tinted sky came in from the east, I watched it from the window, the way you watch something you are not sure you are allowed to want this much. I watched it until the campus was the size of a hand, then the size of a coin, then until the purple dark took it and there was only space. I kept watching after that, just in case it came back into view.